outstanding speakers today. And one is Ramesh. He's a professor at Australian National University. He was senior vice rector of UN University in the United Nations. And also he worked very closely with Secretary General Kofi Annan, rank as Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. He has been doing, he's also editor-in-chief of Global Governance, the most prominent journal in the field of international organization, international law, and etc. But he has been paying a lot of attention to this arms control and nuclear disarmament and etc. And also, he has recently published a book on the right to protect in a theoretical perspective. Let us give a big applause to Ramesh. We have John Carlson. John Carlson is one of the superb experts on nuclear issues. He retired from Australian government position of Director General of Nuclear Safeguard and Non-Proliferation. He used to work for Alberta, and he's one of inside the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, and he has technical expertise on these issues, including the recent Iranian nuclear deal. One more note I want to add is, in fact, there is a very interesting organization called the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which is now co-chaired by Sam Nunn and former Senator Sam Nunn, and who is the co-chair?
Dick Lugar.
No, Dick's gone. Ted Turner is still co-chair.
Ted Turner co-chair.
And Des Brown.
Des Brown is vice chair.
Vice chair.
And the Nuclear Threat Initiative has global networks. Therefore, European leadership networks on non-proliferation and nuclear disarmament, and Asia-Pacific leadership networks, and Latin American networks, and African networks. And up until recently, Gareth Evans, former Foreign Minister of Australia, served as a convener of Asia-Pacific leadership network. And starting from this month, September, Ramesh and I will be convening the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network. Therefore, it is kinds of our launching in a seminar to bless this new initiative. Anyhow, he will be leader and I will follow. But this is very significant. You may be shocked that our office is small and shabby, but great ideas and great achievement usually made in this small office. Okay. We do not have beautiful houses like ASEAN Research Institute, okay? But don't be disappointed by that. Sven, why are you smiling? Sven is Frederick Abbott, Stifton representative here. And Dr. Norbert is from Adenauer. Therefore, we maintain very good relationship with Germans, particularly on the unification issue. And now we have new ties with Australia. And as I pointed out, Dr. Hwang Yong-soo is kind of the leader in shaping our policy on nuclear issues, including North Korea and Iran issues too. He's a real pusher, and we are very lucky to have him here. And we have some other diplomat journalists over here. Okay, Ramesh.
Thanks, Chung-in. Just to pick up on that point about the APLN, we decided that it needed two of us to begin to approach the level of energy and effectiveness that Gareth by himself has in any field of endeavor he undertakes. Thank you for organizing this. Thank you to the East Asia Foundation as well. What I will do is talk about the Iran deal in a larger political and geopolitical context, and then John, who's got the detailed technical expertise, will talk about some of those aspects both today and prospectively as we go forward, and what that might mean. Now, as you know, the international community has had suspicions about potential military dimensions and weaponization dimensions of Iran's nuclear program for a very long time. And this has been a matter of concern because it would have adverse and negative impacts on virtually all the dimensions of nuclear issues. nuclear proliferation, because it would have flow-on consequences for other actors in the region and beyond who might also decide to follow a weaponization capability if Iran gets it and is allowed to keep it. Disarmament, because any fresh item of concern on the non-proliferation agenda makes it that much more difficult to persuade those who have weapons to reduce and eliminate theirs, because they justify the latest proliferation as an excuse for keeping theirs, if not expanding their capability. Safety and security and terrorism issues, well, there's all sorts of things with that, including Iran's own past behavior as sponsoring acts of terrorism various places. And of course, from a parochial Western policy point of view, Iran has also sponsored anti-Western factions in Iraq, Afghanistan and Lebanon. That said, I think we need to put into context past efforts by Iran to procure nuclear-related and dual-use material and equipment, to develop means of producing undeclared nuclear material, tap into clandestine networks for obtaining information and documentation, and work on an indigenous nuclear weapons capability by asking what was its interest in the war? Why was it pursuing this? And then if you look out at the world from Tehran, it's a good example of how even the paranoid do have some real enemies. To its east, Pakistan, India, China, countries with nuclear weapons, with some of which it has troubled relationships. To the north, Russia. To the west, Israel. Further afield northwest, some European powers. American forces and military facilities all around it. A long history of belligerent rhetoric, threats, and acts of interference and intervention by major Western powers, many of which are deeply, deeply seared into Iran's collective memory and consciousness. Add to that the reality of the Sunni Shia divisions and the Arab, non-Arab divisions, plus the fact that Iran was the victim of chemical weapons used by Saddam Hussein, in reaction to which the West and the United Nations suggested a degree of moral equivalence which was completely at variance with the facts. So the surprise, if you put all that together, is not that it might be interested in nuclear weapons, but why, given its capabilities, it didn't actually pursue it with greater determination and get it. One answer to the last question is that more than anything else, if the driver of Iran's interest in the nuclear weapons side was Saddam Hussein and the fight and the war with the bitter 8-year war with Iraq, then a major unintended consequence of the US invasion of Iraq and toppling of Saddam Hussein was that they took care of the real enemy as far as Iran's nuclear weapons program was concerned. So the reason they stopped in 2003, as is the consensus opinion of the American intelligence community, has less to do with the fact that they were afraid that they might be next on the agenda of regime change, and more to do with the fact that Saddam Hussein was taken care of. And then the balance of benefits and consequences shifts, and the balance of interest in and capability versus the bomb shifts as well. The other thing to remember in that is the impact of not just 2003 but subsequent events, the lack of forceful action against North Korea, the toppling of Gaddafi, and so on and so forth, and the conclusions that are drawn, which I think are wrong, but perceptions become important in explaining decisions by the elite. And Ayatollah Khamenei said about Gaddafi, this gentleman, and I'm quoting his words, obviously a translation, this gentleman wrapped up all his nuclear facilities, packed them on a ship, and delivered them to the West and said, take them. Look where we are and in what position they are now, unquote. So the belief that seems to persist in too many Western capitals that what we do in one place has no consequences elsewhere is a very false belief, and patently so. Now, because I'm speaking here, I wanted to make a couple of points about how, even though there are certain similarities structurally in proliferation concerns in different parts of the world, Iran is nonetheless different, for example, and distinctive compared both to North Korea and let's say even Pakistan. There is nothing remotely comparable to the Kim dynasty in Iran. They are amongst the most democratic regimes in the Middle East when you look at many regimes around them. In the past, they have had a vibrant secular middle class that can be recreated in the future potentially. It is not the case, as in Pakistan, that the military is in charge of nuclear policy and security policy. The writ of the Ayatollahs does run supreme in this case. And they haven't got a history of aggression. The last time they engaged in aggression against another country was at least 2 centuries ago, if not longer. So I think we need to discuss and treat Iran in its own terms for that reason. Also, there is no credible evidence that I can see that Iran actually ever crossed the threshold into weapons production as opposed to acquiring capability. And I personally have no reason to doubt that the religious leadership is sincere when it expresses religious opposition, very strong opposition to the bomb as being fundamentally un-Islamic. And for those of us who are from a particular generation, if you go back to the mid-80s, imagine if the Catholic bishops around the world had actually exercised veto over our security policy and development of the bomb. You have that directly equivalent situation in Iran. And again, a statement from Ayatollah Khamenei that atomic bomb possession is pointless, dangerous, and a great sin from an intellectual and religious point of view, unquote. On top of this, they are only too well aware of the risks of very likely Israeli and or American military strikes if they did cross the threshold. In that context, the Bush years proved to be absolutely disastrous for efforts to contain the nuclear weapons program, in this case both of North Korea and Iran. The neoconservatives, the neocons, believed in using US power to transform the world. They were openly disdainful of arms control treaties and diplomacy, and believed in eliminating regimes rather than eliminating weapons. And there's a wonderful quote from the late Robin Cook, the British Foreign Secretary, when he said to them, allies are proof of military weakness, not evidence of diplomatic strength. And that was a major factor. When Clinton left office, Iran had a tentative nuclear research program with a few test centrifuges. By the end of Bush's 2 terms, Iran had an industrial-sized uranium program and thousands of operational centrifuges. So when we evaluate the current deal, I think it's worth remembering a bit of history in terms of the different approaches and what they got us. Now, Iran did continue to work on its nuclear enrichment and energy program. Its centrifuges multiplied, even though they were first generation 50s technology, from 164 in 2003 to 19,000 in 2013 in the 10-year program, of which 11,000 were operational. The November 2013 interim deal led to a situation where Iran agreed to scale back its weapon-sensitive material and activities under IAEA oversight in return for some immediate sanctions relief and negotiations to achieve a permanent transition of this interim deal, which is what the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action amounts to. So the tough UN, US and European sanctions to try and abort Iran's march to weapons capability had hurt Iran. But in the meantime, the United States also was paying a heavy price militarily, financially and reputationally for its addiction to invading Islamic countries and killing Muslims in large numbers. And then what the scholars like to say, we had the situation of a hurting stalemate. Both sides were losing and they wanted to shift to negotiations from outright confrontation. And in that sense, I believe that the 2013 interim deal resulted not from Tehran's capitulation, but from the election of a new president who was keen to explore a rapprochement with EU and the West and the US. And it resulted from a shift in the US red line from no capability to no bomb. So we can accept capability, but we won't accept bomb. I think the conclusion was that an effort to verifiably and irreversibly roll back Iran's capability in terms of enrichment, materials and breakout was futile. The key question was, how can we widen the gap between capability and weaponization in terms of materials and technical capability? How can we increase confidence in our ability to detect any effort at breakout? And how can we ensure that if we do detect such effort, we can take effective action before they actually get the bomb? So the real policy challenge became to accept Iran as nuclear capable, but neither to accept it as nuclear armed, nor to provoke it into becoming nuclear armed. And this, I think, has been successfully achieved in the Iran deal. And in that sense, it is potentially the most significant agreement on Middle Eastern affairs since the Oslo Accords of 1993. It could prove the defining legacy of Iran's precedent and the defining foreign policy legacy of the Obama administration. It's not a perfect deal for us. It doesn't roll back Iran's nuclear program. It does not end all its enrichment. Nor is it the best possible deal for Iran, because sanctions will be phased out only gradually over 5 to 8 years, and they can be restored rapidly if suspicions give rise to the belief that Iran is cheating. And also because the IAEA will have more intrusive access than has ever been the case with any country that was not actually defeated. So the level of inspections is unprecedented. But it is a good deal because it is acceptable to all parties, the essence of diplomatic negotiations. The international community's bottom lines were to deter, dissuade and delay nuclear weaponization by Iran. Second, to detect any efforts at nuclear breakout by Iran. And third, if Iran is caught cheating, to have sufficient time to coax and or to coerce it back into the non-nuclear box. That has been achieved through a reasonably robust transparency, inspections and consequences regime on Iran's nuclear program. Iran's bottom lines were to protect the principle of its right to enrichment, not to close any existing facilities, and to resist inspection of its military facilities. They've given ground on the last, but they've achieved the first two. So bottom lines were met on both sides, maximum ambitious goals were not met on either side. And that is the key to success of the deal. It is also the key to, I think, why the deal is likely to survive essentially intact rather than collapse, because both sides gain more than they lose on that. So what does it do? First, it halts and reverses Iran's weapons-sensitive nuclear program over the next 10 to 15 years. The plutonium pathway is more or less completely closed. The uranium pathway is severely restricted. And these are done by diluting and bringing down the physical capability to produce weapons. No plutonium production, no existing spent fuel to be exported and kept under oversight overseas. Uranium stockpile to go down by 98% to 300 kilogram. Enrichment level to be restricted to 3.67%. Only one facility in Natanz to have enrichment, the other to be closed down and converted into R&D efforts, and so on and so forth. So both pathways are either eliminated or dramatically curtailed. Second, inspections regime, and the IAEA has publicly stated that it's satisfied with the access. It has not compromised any of its safeguard standards, and it believes it can do the job with the existing agreement, with some things to be worked out still, but they think they can do that. As a result, we believe, and certainly the language is, that the breakout time will extend and lengthen from the presently assessed 2 to 3 months, although I suspect that may be an exaggeration, to a minimum of 12 months, maybe even 15 months. And that will give us sufficient time to be able to react should we detect that. So, it's not a perfect agreement because it's a negotiated agreement. It's not perfect because it does not follow complete capitulation by Iran. But what are the alternatives? Realistically, there's two: sanctions and military strikes. It seems extraordinary to me as an outside observer that so many lawmakers in Washington don't realize that this was a multilateral international deal, not a bilateral US-Iranian negotiation. Because it is seen as reasonable and doing the job in capping capability without leading to weaponization, if Congress were to reject it, the broad sanctions coalition would collapse. There is no way that we would expect reasonably China and India and Russia and others not to resume normal commerce with Iran. So the pressure that has been brought to bear would dissipate. Iran will be able to resume activities with less international pressure than what we have at the moment. Unilateral American sanctions would not have the same effect. Military strikes. I think all reasonable analysts, including Israeli military and intelligence people when they are allowed to speak out, especially former ones, agree that military strikes would represent a setback to Iran's capability, but that the setback would be temporary, for 2 or 3 years, and the political result would be all Iranian elements would unite behind the regime, and the regime, no matter its composition, would then launch a determined pursuit for getting the bomb. And they wouldn't have international inspections, and they wouldn't have international sanctions. So the opposition is that this kicks the can down the road. It allows them to increase the sophistication of the capability, and then they can rush to bomb once 10 to 15 year time frame is over. I think it buys us the time to change the geopolitical configuration so that we reduce their incentive to get the bomb. And let us not forget, they remain legally obligated under the NPT, even at the end of 15 years, not to get the bomb. And if vulnerabilities are discovered in the interim, working with the IAEA, the American and allied intelligence community can work to plug the vulnerabilities. So I think all reasonable elements of caution and precaution are there, safeguards are there, it's worth doing. And if it does go ahead and our assessment is correct that they have sufficient merits from their point of view, that they will honor the essence of the commitments, even though we can always expect bickering over interpretations and technical details, then I think it becomes a geopolitical game changer for the region. Why? Because the sad reality is that the enmity between the United States and Iran since the Islamic Revolution has framed the geopolitics of the entire region. And this deal has the potential to unlock that frame. And if you can then partner with Iran on those goals and objectives that we share or which overlap, stabilizing Afghanistan, stabilizing Iraq, reducing elements of unpredictability and tensions and volatility, while maintaining a cautious watch on other elements where we are in opposition, then I think we can, as I said, recreate that powerful middle class in Iranian society, dilute the influence of the radical clergy, encourage tendencies that are more in line with us. And I've been to the country, and I have no doubt that the Iranian youth aspire to very similar values that we take for granted in the West. And I think we can restore the sense of dignity and pride to what is, after all, a very ancient culture and civilization, and harness its potential for stability while muting its potential for harm on certain other agendas. And that gives us that 15-year time frame to be able to do this. And that does require mutual understanding and mutual accommodation. It's not going to be a case where we give up on everything that we want through a policy of appeasement. It's not going to be a case that we demand that they give up everything through capitulation. But let's embed them in regional and global normative structures and regimes, so that we can pursue common agendas. And certainly overall reduce the element of nuclear brinksmanship and tension. That does mean, and this is my final comment, at some stage, in some way or another, we are going to have to address the reality of Iran's nuclear weapons. I don't think outside the region, Israel's nuclear weapons. I don't think outside the region people impose any moral equivalence in terms of perception of threat between Israel having 100 nuclear weapons and Iran having nuclear weapons. They are completely different. Nonetheless, it is impossible for me to imagine in perpetuity Israel can be allowed to keep its nuclear weapons, but no other country in the region will ever get it. That equation just doesn't compute. So at some time we are going to have to address that issue as well. I'll stop there and hand it over to John.
Thank you, Chugin, and thank you, Ramesh, for laying such good groundwork. I was asked to talk about verification aspects, which are a bit technical, and also to talk about the implications for the future, both in terms of Iran and more broadly. I think I'd like to skip over, in the interest of time, a lot of the technical stuff. I've had printed off my notes. They're copies. I noticed we walked past coming into this room, so for those of you who don't have the notes already, please get them, and then you'll see the details that I've gone over. So let me make a couple of introductory remarks. First, as Ramesh says, the deal buys time. It does not resolve the problem. It gives us a 15-year breathing space in which to develop a more lasting resolution. For me, what that means is we can't afford to lose time. We have 15 years in which to work across a number of fronts to change Iran's perspective of the world and its own perspective of the security problems it faces, and so on. My second general comment is that the deal is not actually a legally binding agreement. It's not a treaty. It's loosely referred to as an agreement, but in a legal sense it's not. It's a voluntary undertaking. It comprises political commitments. Any party can withdraw at any time. The status, and this is a rather horrible precedent, I think the status is broadly similar to the agreed framework that the US had with the DPRK. But there are some major differences. One is that what I'll call the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, is much more specific, at 150 pages. A massive detail. Now some people might think, well, all that detail provides opportunities for differing interpretations and so on. But to me, that's a very encouraging sign. The fact that Iran was prepared to commit to such a level of specificity indicates to me that there's a great seriousness on the Iranian side, and that provides confidence of Iran's commitment to the deal. To move on to some details, Ramesh said that the level of inspection in Iran will be unprecedented. I'd probably differ a little bit with him on that. Just a little bit though, I mean this is marginal, because actually the level of inspection builds only a little bit on what would be allowed under the IAEA's Safeguards Additional Protocol. And some people are a bit disappointed that the inspection regime is not more intrusive. There were people who wanted an anywhere, anytime regime, such as operated in Iraq. And Ramesh's point is absolutely right, that it's a different situation. Iran is not a defeated country. Its agreement is required to any of this, and anywhere, anytime was a step too far. What we have are three different verification regimes will apply in Iran. First is the standard IAEA Safeguards Agreement that has applied all along. Second is the additional protocol, which gives the IAEA additional access rights, additional information rights. Iran had actually signed an additional protocol and had applied it provisionally in the mid-2000s. I've forgotten the years now, 2004 to 2006, something like that.
3 and 6.
3 to 6, yeah. And then Iran ceased the provisional application of the protocol. So under the joint plan, the protocol comes back in, and again it'll be provisional, but Iran has undertaken under its constitutional arrangements to submit the protocol to the Majlis, the Parliament, for ratification at a certain stage in the process. And then the third type of verification is verification of voluntary measures, and Iran has put forward a number of voluntary confidence building measures which are unprecedented. So maybe it's not so much the verification that's unprecedented, but the nature of these confidence building steps to keep the enrichment program at a minimal level, to limit its R&D activities, to limit the quantity of enriched uranium it has in country, to modify the Arak reactor, which a lot of people were worried about, looked very much like the kind of reactor that India and Israel had as so-called research reactors that were actually plutonium producers. ARAC will be modified in such a way that it becomes relatively useless for plutonium production. And Iran has also undertaken that the spent fuel will be removed from Iran for the life of the reactor. So that is a substantial step. Iran has agreed to the monitoring of its production of centrifuge components. Now that actually is in the additional protocol anyway, although maybe not spelled out as clearly. What is very interesting is that the plan of action itemises activities that are regarded as potential weaponisation activities. And this is the first time, as far as I'm aware, that this has been done in any kind of document like this. We all have in our minds what kind of activities we regard as suspicious of being dual purpose or worse, directly weaponisation. And now this has been described in an agreed document, and Iran has agreed not to engage in those activities, except for a couple of areas where it would first seek the agreement of the Joint Commission under this action plan. And if it does proceed with any of those activities, they will be under IEA monitoring. So that's, in that sense, Ramesh is right, that this is going much further, even on the verification front. And Iran has agreed to a procurement channel where all its nuclear-related imports will be vetted by the IAEA. To do all of this, the IAEA is seeking additional funding from member states of 9.2 billion euro a year. So it's a substantial effort in terms of the verification activity. I won't, since I don't have much time left, I won't go through all the details on page 2 of my notes. Happy to answer any questions, but I think it's fairly self-explanatory. Essentially, the main limitations under the plan of action only last for 15 years. And after 15 years, there are a number of freedoms Iran has, unless something else is agreed meanwhile. For instance, Iran can start to expand the enrichment program, and clearly that's a matter that needs a longer term solution to be developed over the 15 years that we've got. Beyond 15 years, there are some commitments that are ongoing. Monitoring of centrifuge manufacturing will continue for 20 years. Monitoring of uranium production, mining and milling, will continue for 25 years. The commitment to ratify the additional protocol would be permanent. Once it's ratified, it's in place. So that's an ongoing aspect of all of this. The commitment to send all spent fuel from the ARAC reactor out of the country is ongoing for the whole life of the reactor. That's not time bound. Iran has given commitments on the potential weaponisation activity, which aren't time bound, so we assume they will be ongoing. Iran has agreed to accept a long-term presence in Iran of the IAEA, although the wording is a bit fuzzy on that because it's described as for the purposes of the plan of action, so it's not really clear what kind of time limit there would be on that. And the other important point is that Iran has said it has no interest in reprocessing, extracting plutonium. That has an indefinite duration, that commitment, so it's not permanent, but there's an expectation that it won't happen. So what happens when the plan of action comes to an end? as I touched on before, Iran has plans to expand its enrichment activity. It interprets the plan of action as recognising its right to enrich. The US is adamant that it doesn't, that the plan of action simply recognises facts on the ground rather than recognising any long-term principles. So there's an unresolved issue, if you like. Iran is talking about expanding its enrichment activity by a factor of 200 compared with what it's allowed under the plan. And this would be sufficient. It's talking about wanting to have the capacity to fuel 5 reactors. Now, if Iran builds a plant of that scale, the potential breakout period in terms of how long would it take to produce enough highly enriched uranium for a weapon, and that's leaving aside the weaponization aspects, but just to produce the material, the breakout period, which under the plan is 12 months. With a 1 million SWU plant, a plant that's big enough to fuel 5 reactors, that time to produce enough HEU for 1 warhead is about a day and a half. A day and a half. And safeguards cannot cope with something that can happen that rapidly. Sure, IAEA inspectors could ring their bosses in Vienna immediately and say something funny is happening at the Iranian enrichment plant, but by the time people got together to talk about it, what does it all mean, and so on and so forth, the material could already be out the plant and gone to a place unknown to be weaponised, and the opportunity to stop that has gone because we wouldn't know where to start bombing, if that's what it came to. So I think that's a critical situation for the future. One of the ideas kicked around is can we work into what follows the plan an international norm which says that fuel cycle capabilities must not exceed demonstrated requirements, and on that principle you'd say Iran should not be enriching at the moment because the two reactors it has, a research reactor and a power reactor, have both got guarantees of fuel supply, external fuel supply. So on that basis you'd say Iran should not be enriching. But if Iran has 5 power reactors, then depending on what fuel supply arrangements there are, Iran could have a case, a legitimate case for saying we need a plant, an enrichment plant that's big enough to fuel those reactors, and that straight away gets into the problem I mentioned, that the scale of the thing in breakout time terms is scary. I think to find a solution to all of this, there are two key issues that must be addressed. One are legitimate concerns Iran has about security of supply of fuel. The Iranian argument for why it built its enrichment plant at Natanz underground was, and you might choose to believe or not believe this, but the argument was, no one wants us to have a nuclear power program. As soon as our enemies, the United States and Israel in brackets, knew that we were building enrichment, they would bomb it. So we tried to hide what we were doing. And as I said, you take that with a grain of salt, but the point is, Iran is not confident that if it's dependent on outside suppliers for fuel, that supply won't be interrupted. So we, the international community, need to develop arrangements which provide an absolute guarantee of fuel supply, or else Iran will say it has good reason to need to be self-sufficient. The other issue that must be addressed is the Iranian interest in having a nuclear weapon option as a strategic deterrent. And in the days when I used to talk to Iranians, they were quite blunt about it. They said, we live in a dangerous neighbourhood. We're surrounded by countries that we believe will seek nuclear capability, and we need a deterrent against that. And they see that having a breakout capability is a strategic deterrent. I argued, well, all that does really is provoke the enemies into having the same thing. So sure, you've got an advantage now, but that advantage could go very quickly, and then you'll be a lot worse off. So we need to work on that. Security of supply can be addressed by international fuel guarantees, a fuel bank, fuel partnerships. There are a whole range of ideas that need to be developed. The strategic dimensions are much more challenging, and there I think we have to recognise that Iran's concerns are real, and they're brought on, as Ramesh said, by the experience of the Iran-Iraq war and the having a lunatic living next door who was trying to build nuclear weapons, and I don't think anyone believes that if he had nuclear weapons he wouldn't have used them. We need to be able to, we the international community need to be able to convince Iran that its own security is not dependent on having a nuclear weapon option. And to do that, I think we need to set up a WMD-free zone and backed by security guarantees, and that has to involve Israel, as Ramesh said. Now, just very quickly, because I'm almost out of time, to talk about the broader lessons, and I've touched on some of them already. The failure to address control over enrichment and reprocessing sensitive nuclear technologies is a fundamental weakness in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We're fortunate that to date these technologies have not become widespread. The major enrichment programs today are either operated by nuclear weapon states or by the Urenco consortium, which has Germany and Netherlands as well as the UK. But we do have civilian programs today in Japan, Argentina, Brazil, and of course Iran. Fortunately, civilian reprocessing is limited only to nuclear weapon states as of this moment, but of course everyone is concerned about the start-up of Rakosho in Japan, a very large-scale reprocessing plant, and I won't touch on Japan's stockpiling of plutonium. The basic problem with national programs in these areas is that a state's intentions can change over time. In Iran's case, we're hoping that a program that began in highly suspicious circumstances will be limited to a peaceful program. In other countries, we could have the reverse concern, that a problem that starts as a clearly peaceful program, its purpose might change some decades down the track when the strategic circumstances of that country change. There's no doubt that the further spread of enrichment and reprocessing capabilities will increase global proliferation risk and could lead to virtual arms races in particular areas. I'd also note that national enrichment reprocessing capabilities are going to be an issue when the process of nuclear disarmament really gets underway. And you can see I'm an optimist. I talk about when it happens, not if. But clearly, in a circumstance where nuclear weapon states are running down their arsenals, they will be very concerned about the breakout or reconstitution capabilities of other weapon states. So I think this issue of who should control enrichment and reprocessing doesn't just apply to non-nuclear weapon states, it applies equally to weapon states in the future. So my ending note is we need to develop multilateral approaches to the proliferation sensitive aspects of the fuel cycle, and a solution that can meet Iran's needs will be a solution that can meet the needs of other countries. Now, a country that I haven't mentioned in all of this is South Korea. South Korea feels strongly that it should have enrichment for fuel supply security. It has a power program large enough to justify it. And it also feels that it needs to do spent fuel treatment with pyroprocessing, which Koreans don't like to call reprocessing, but it's a technical argument. These interests and requirements need to be accommodated in such a way that proliferation threats or perceived proliferation threats are resolved, and to me that really means a multilateral approach. And I'll finish on that note. Thank you.